A 7-year-old girl walked through a Chicago snowstorm in the middle of the night, in worn-out sneakers soaked through with snow, carrying nothing but a gold signet ring her mother had hidden for 7 years. When she pushed open the heavy oak door of the most exclusive Italian restaurant in South Loop, where the most feared Mafia boss in the city was sitting among 20 armed men, and told him she wanted to sell the ring to pay for her mother's dialysis so she wouldn't die, the entire restaurant went silent. Forks froze midair. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. Conversations died in the space of a single heartbeat. The boss's hand tightened around his wine glass the moment he saw what was sitting in the child's palm, because it was his dead father's ring, the one he'd spent 7 years and a small fortune trying to find, the only one of its kind ever crafted, a lion crest carved into black onyx with a scratch on the right edge that only 2 people in the world would ever recognize. What he asked next made his most trusted man turn his face toward the wall so no one would see what was happening behind his eyes. And before the snow stopped falling, 12 black armored SUVs were tearing through the city toward the poorest neighborhood on the south side. What the most ruthless man in Chicago did when he stepped into that crumbling studio apartment and saw the woman lying on the bed changed everything. Not just the girl's life, not just her mother's life, but the empire he'd built with blood and iron and silence. If you believe no child should ever have to sell the only thing her father left behind just to keep her mother breathing, stay with this story. Hit that like button so more people can hear Rosie's story. Share it with someone who needs it tonight. And tap subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now let's go back to the very beginning. Back to the moment little Rosie slipped out of that apartment while her mother was sleeping, tucked a ring into the pocket of an oversized coat that smelled like hospital soap and cheap detergent, and started walking alone toward the city lights. That night, Chicago dropped to -15 degrees, and the snow wouldn't stop falling. Heavy grains like salt that cut into skin when the wind shoved them sideways through empty streets. Rosie Holloway stood in the darkness of the 4th-floor studio apartment in Englewood, her back against the bedroom door, listening. Her mother's breathing was steady and heavy, the unnatural rhythm pulled into sleep by pain medication after a long night. Bryn lay on the bed with one hand still pressed to her chest, as if even in dreams she was trying to keep her heart from slipping out of its cage. On the table beside the bed were 3 pill bottles lined up, 2 nearly empty, one that had been empty for 3 days now. Rosie looked at her mother one more time and then turned away. She did not turn on the light. She did not need to. She knew every step in this apartment by heart, which floorboard creaked, which corner held a crack, which smell belonged where. Medicine by her mother's bed, canned soup from the kitchen, damp rot from the leaking window the landlord never fixed. She crept to the space under the bed, lay flat on the cold floor, slid her hand into the darkness until her fingers touched the tin box. Small, light, the lid slightly rusted. She opened it. Inside there was only one thing resting on old velvet, a gold ring, heavier than anything she had ever held, its black stone carved with a lion wearing a crown. Her mother never wore it, but some nights, when her mother thought Rosie was asleep, the girl heard the tin open and her mother crying very softly, the kind of crying grown-ups try to swallow but that still leaks through their fingers. Once Rosie asked who the ring belonged to. Her mother stayed quiet for a long time, then said it belonged to someone she met before she had a child, someone very important, and the ring was worth a lot, but she would never sell it. Rosie did not ask again. But she remembered. She remembered everything. She remembered last night, when the phone rang at 9 o'clock, and her mother answered, and her whole body tightened, as if the man's voice on the other end could strike straight through the line. Rosie lay on the mattress on the floor, pretending to sleep, eyes open, listening to every word. The man's voice was loud enough that she heard it even without speaker, talking about money, about interest, about taking everything, about there being nothing left to negotiate. And then he said one sentence that made her mother clutch her chest and gasp. A sentence Rosie did not fully understand, but that carried her name inside it. After the call, her mother did not cry right away. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, both hands gripping the pillow, staring at the floor. Then her shoulders began to shake. Then the crying broke free. The crying of someone who had held on too long and could not anymore. Rosie lay still, eyes open in the dark, clutching her blanket, and decided. Now she stood in the kitchen, pushing the ring into the pocket of her coat, her mother's old puffer jacket. 3 times too big for her. Sleeves longer than her fingers, the smell of hospital soap and cheap detergent still clinging to the fabric no matter how many times it had been washed. She zipped it up to her chin, slipped on the only thin sneakers she owned, the pair worn so smooth she could feel every crack in the sidewalk through the rubber, and opened the door to the hallway. The stairwell was dark. The third-floor bulb had been out since last month. Mildew clung to the walls. She went down, step by step, light-footed. Outside, the wind slapped her face like winter's open hand. Snow dusted her shoulders in seconds. Rosie lowered her head and started walking. She knew where to go. 3 months earlier, on the number 7 bus ride home after dialysis, her mother had sat by the window staring out. The bus passed through South Loop, past a restaurant glowing with glass walls, gold letters on the roof, warm light inside, elegant silhouettes moving behind curtains. Her mother stared for a long time, so long that Rosie had to tug her sleeve. Her mother said nothing, just turned back with red eyes, lips pressed tight, and looked down at her hands. Rosie did not know what her mother saw in that restaurant, but she remembered the name on the roof, Valenti's. She remembered because she spelled it in her head the whole way home. Now she stood at the Halstead bus stop, alone, 7 years old, past midnight, snow settling into her dark curls. The CTA night bus pulled up, doors opening, warmth spilling out, the driver looking at her and then around for an adult. There was no one. Rosie stepped on, dropped $1.25 into the box, money she had gathered from the loose change her mother tossed into the kitchen drawer, and sat in the front row, both hands in her pockets, one hand gripping the ring. The metal had warmed from her body heat. The bus rolled through dark streets, under the Dan Ryan overpass, past closed shops with rusted shutters, past intersections where only red lights blinked and not a soul stood waiting. Rosie stared through the window without blinking, counting each stop. When the bus neared South Loop, she pulled the cord, stepped down, and walked the last stretch. Snow had soaked through her sneakers. Her socks were wet, her toes numb, but she did not stop. In her mind there was only one image, her mother on the bed clutching her chest and breathing in small sips as if each breath cost money. And one single question: if this ring was truly worth what her mother said, then would someone in that bright restaurant buy it? And if they did, then her mother would live. She saw it from the corner of the block, warm yellow light spilling from wide glass doors through the curtain of snow, like a promise she did not know was real. The name Valenti's glowed on the marquee in thin gold letters, exactly as she remembered from the bus window 3 months earlier, exactly as she had spelled it in her head hundreds of times since that day. Rosie stopped before the oak door, a door 3 times her height, so heavy that the polished brass handle looked like something from another world. She drew a long breath, her toes numb inside soaked sneakers, then pushed with both hands. The door opened, and everything changed. Heat rushed at her face like an invisible wall, a kind of warmth her mother's studio apartment had never known. Warmth scented with oak, beeswax candles, grilled meat, and spices she did not know the names of. Soft golden light spread across the ceiling. Crystal glittered along a long table. White tablecloths lay without a single crease. White porcelain plates rimmed in gold lined up like small moons. The smell of red wine, truffle, money. Then she crossed the threshold, snow sliding from the shoulders of her oversized coat onto marble tiles in small melting piles. Dark curls plastered to her forehead, cheeks burning red from the wind, thin sneakers leaving dirty water trails across the gleaming floor. She looked like a drop of ink fallen onto white paper. 2 large men stepped out and blocked her at the door. Black suits, earpieces, shoulders as wide as the doorway. One placed a hand on her shoulder, not rough but firm, the kind of touch grown-ups use when they mean go elsewhere without speaking. Rosie did not step back. She lifted her face to meet the guard's eyes. Her neck craned because he was 3 times her height, and said in a small but steady voice, "I need to see the owner here." The guard looked at his partner. The partner looked back. Neither had been trained for this. They knew guns. They knew knives. They knew drunks. But a 7-year-old girl soaked with snow standing in the doorway of Valenti's restaurant near midnight asking to see the boss was not in any protocol. Before they could react, she slipped through the gap between their bodies and walked straight inside. Inside the restaurant, 20 men sat around a long dining table, black suits, charcoal suits, white shirts, silk ties. Beneath the perfect tailoring, the hard outlines of pistols showed at hips and underarms, not hidden, not needing to be hidden, because in this room, everyone knew what everyone carried. Crystal glasses held red wine. Plates of lobster pasta rested before them. White candles burned evenly down the center. This was the Valenti family's Friday night dinner, a ritual Dario had kept since his father was alive, a door no one outside the family was allowed to cross. Until tonight. Everything stopped at once, not slowly, not the way a room pauses as heads turn one by one, but all at once, as if someone had pressed pause on the entire space. Forks froze midair, glasses hovered before lips, conversations died halfway through sentences. 20 pairs of eyes locked onto the child walking through the restaurant, leaving a trail of water on the floor, an oversized coat hanging to her knees, one hand clenched around something that glinted, though no one yet saw what it was. At the far end of the table sat a man. A black three-piece suit, white shirt open at the top, 2 buttons, no tie. His left wrist showed as his hand rested on the table, wrapped in a thorned vine tattoo that climbed from the back of his hand into his sleeve, black ink on brown skin, sharp as if done yesterday, though it had been there more than 10 years. A faint scar ran along the bridge of his nose, thin as a silver hair, a souvenir from a night no one at the table mentioned anymore. Black eyes, cold, the kind that never told anyone what he was thinking until it was too late. Dario Valenti, 37 years old, head of the Valenti family, the man half of Chicago owed money to, and the other half owed their lives. He had been speaking with Nico Santoro at his right when the room fell silent. He looked up, saw the girl, and did not signal the guards to stop her. Nico turned toward him, waiting for an order. The order did not come, because Dario was watching how the child walked. She did not look around. She did not scan the room. She did not hesitate. She walked straight toward him as if a room full of armed men were nothing but furniture, and Dario knew that walk. He had seen it before, in mirrors, in the years after his father fell to 3 bullets on the steps of St. Ignatius, when Dario had just turned 23. It was the walk of someone who had lost too much and had no strength left for fear. The walk of someone who had run out of doors to knock on and was wagering everything on the last one. The girl approached his table, and Dario, the man no one in Chicago dared to look in the eye, sat in silence and waited. Rosie stopped at the edge of the table, close enough for candlelight to wash over her face, close enough for Dario to see the cracks in her dry lips and the way her chin trembled even as her jaw clenched to keep it still. She swallowed, and the room was so silent the sound carried like a stone dropped into a deep well. 20 men who had once sat unmoving while gunfire cracked in the streets now sat frozen, watching a 7-year-old girl pull words up through fear. A waiter stood rooted beside the bar, a bottle held midair. A cook leaned out from the kitchen doorway, towel on his shoulder, eyes fixed on her. The whole restaurant tilted toward Rosie, as if gravity itself had shifted. Then she spoke. Her voice was small and shaking, but each word was clear, the blunt language of a child that did not know how to circle pain or hide it, only how to point straight at the wound. "My mom is sick," Rosie said. "My mom has to go to the hospital every week so they can hook her to a machine that cleans her blood. She says if she does not have that machine, then her kidneys do not work and she will die." She paused for a beat and drew in air as if she needed more of it to keep going. "But the hospital called and said my mom owes too much money, and they are going to stop letting her use the machine. And there is a man named Kovac who calls every night. He yells a lot. He says my mom owes him money, and if she does not pay, he will take everything. Last night he said my name on the phone, and my mom cried a lot after she hung up." Around the table, a few men went rigid. A child's name spoken in a debt call needed no explanation for anyone in this room. Nico looked down at the wineglass before him, his fingers tightening around the stem until his knuckles went white. "And then the landlord put a red paper on our door." Rosie went on, her voice speeding up now as if once the dam had broken the water could not be held back. "The paper has big letters. I cannot read all of it, but after my mom read it, she sat on the kitchen floor for a long time and did not get up. She said this weekend if we do not pay, they will kick us out. I do not know where we will go. My mom does not have anyone." She stopped. The room did not breathe. Then Rosie opened her right hand, slowly, one finger at a time, as if opening a door she knew could never be closed again. The gold ring lay in her small palm, the black onyx face pulling candlelight into a deep dark glow, the crowned lion crest gleaming under warm flame. The ring looked too large, too heavy, too old for that hand. It looked like something from another world resting in this one. "My mom says this is worth a lot," Rosie said, her eyes locked on Dario, blue-gray bright in the candlelight. "She says it belonged to someone important. She says she would never sell it. but I took it while she was sleeping because I do not know what else to do." She drew in another breath, her chest rising beneath the oversized coat. "Will you buy it? So I can pay the doctors. So Mr. Kovac will stop calling. So the landlord will not throw us out. So my mom will not die." The last word fell from her mouth like a stone into still water, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, dense, packed with the weight of every unpaid bill, every midnight call, every red notice, every child in this world who has ever been told in one way or another that money matters more than their mother's heartbeat. No one moved. No one looked away. 20 men who had done things the dark does not repeat now sat watching a 7-year-old girl hold out her father's ring and ask if anyone wanted to trade it for her mother's life. Dario didn't hear anything else. Not the sound of candles burning. Not the breathing of the 20 men around the table. Not the wind against the glass. The world collapsed into a single point, the ring resting in the child's palm. He looked at it, and everything inside him stopped. Not like breath stopping, but like a heart missing a beat, and the body not yet knowing whether it should start again. The crowned lion crest. He saw it with brutal clarity even though candlelight touched only half the stone. Sharp engravings cut into black onyx, the lion's mane flaring like fire, a small crown centered at the top of the beast's head, both forepaws raised in the stance his grandfather used to call the stance of one who doesn't bow. Then he saw the scratch. On the right edge, less than a centimeter long, shallow, almost invisible to anyone who didn't know it was there. But Dario knew. He knew because his father had told the story of that scratch dozens of times, late nights when only the two of them remained in the study after dinner. His father had slammed his hand on the table during the first meeting. Dario led as boss, when he was 26, hard enough that the ring struck the oak edge and left that mark forever. His father had said it was his first lesson, that strength without control leaves scars on the very thing you treasure most. This ring was the only one ever made. Dario's grandfather had commissioned it from a jeweler in Palermo more than 50 years earlier, carried it to America with dreams and blood, passed it to his son, and that son wore it until the day he fell on the steps of St. Ignatius. Dario wore it after that. Then he lost it. 7 years ago. He hired people to search all of Chicago, all of Illinois, the entire country. Jewelers, pawn shops, black markets, underground auctions, no trace. The ring vanished as if it had evaporated from the earth. And now it was here, in the palm of a 7-year-old girl asking him to buy it so her mother would live. Nico, seated at Dario's right, drew in a sharp breath, the kind a man takes when he's been punched in the chest without warning. Nico recognized the ring too. He had stood beside Dario from the beginning, had seen the ring on Dario's father's hand, had seen it on Dario's hand, had seen Dario's fury when it disappeared. Nico turned toward his boss and saw something on Dario's face he'd never seen in 14 years. Not anger, not coldness. Confusion. The kind that comes when the world has tilted 90 degrees and you haven't yet found your balance. A memory flashed in Dario's mind, quick as a camera burst. So brief, he almost didn't catch it. Blue-gray eyes. The balcony of the Palmer House Hotel. A winter night 7 years ago. The scent of jasmine in the hair of a woman whose name he couldn't remember. He crushed the memory instantly because this wasn't the moment, because he needed to understand how the ring had come here. Dario forced calm into his voice, the calm he'd trained his entire life for moments when everything inside was collapsing but the surface couldn't be allowed to move. "This ring," he said slowly, each word placed as gently as a crystal glass on a glass table. "Where did your mother get it?" Rosie looked at him, her head tilting slightly to the left, and that tilt made Dario clench his hand beneath the table, because it was familiar enough to hurt. "My mom keeps it in a tin box under the bed," Rosie said. "She never wears it, but sometimes I see her take it out and look at it. She holds it and cries. When I asked, she said it belonged to someone she met before she had a child. She said that person was very important." Dario studied the child again, but this time, he wasn't looking at a strange girl who'd wandered into a restaurant. He was searching. Black curls, not dark brown but true black. Black like his hair, like his father's, like the hair of every Valenti man across 3 generations. The jawline, small, not fully formed yet, but sharp in a way a child's jaw shouldn't be. Sharp in the way of his blood, the way she tilted her head when she spoke. To the left, exactly like his father in every old photograph. And the eyes, not black like his, blue-gray, bright, clear, sad, unyielding. He'd seen those eyes once in his life, on the balcony of the Palmer House Hotel, 7 years earlier, on the night he tried to drown his father's death in alcohol and the warmth of a stranger. "What's your mother's name?" Dario asked, and his voice changed, only slightly, soft enough that maybe only Nico beside him caught it, but enough to make Nico's hand tighten beneath the table. "Bryn," Rosie said. "Bryn Holloway." The name meant nothing to him. Dario didn't remember it. That night he hadn't asked, and she hadn't said, or she'd said, and he hadn't remembered because alcohol and pain and darkness had swallowed every detail except the eyes. But he didn't need the name, because the math spoke for him. 7 years old. 7 years ago. The ring he'd left on the bedside table of a hotel room the morning he walked out before dawn. The blue-gray eyes of a woman he never went back to find were now looking at him from the face of a child, with Valenti black hair, and a Valenti jaw, and a Valenti tilt of the head. The restaurant floor tilted beneath Dario's feet. Not metaphorically. He truly felt the ground shift, as if someone had lifted one corner of the foundation, and the entire empire he'd built over 14 years was sliding toward the little girl standing before him, with his father's ring in her hand, and the eyes of the woman he'd left behind. 7 years earlier. 7 years earlier. That night, the Palmer House Hotel blazed in the loop like a palace suspended in winter. Bryn Holloway, 21 years old, a third-year nursing student at Malcolm X College, stood in a black and white server uniform inside the 17th floor ballroom, carrying a tray of champagne for men whose names she did not know and was not allowed to ask. She only knew it was a private event, the guests all men in expensive suits, no name tags, no photographs, and the manager had given the staff a single instruction before they entered the room: don't look at anyone for too long, don't listen to anything, don't remember anything. Bryn carried the tray, eyes lowered, steps steady, until she stepped out onto the balcony to breathe cold air and saw a man sitting alone on a wrought iron chair, both hands wrapped around a glass, eyes aimed down at Michigan Avenue below, without truly seeing it. He was 30, dressed in black, a faint scar along the bridge of his nose. And he was drunk, not the kind of drunk that loses control, but the kind of drunk that comes from trying to push something down only to have it surge back up. Bryn should have gone back inside. She didn't. She asked if he was all right, and he looked up at her with black eyes she had never seen on anyone, eyes that were sharp and shattered at the same time, and said no. They talked on that balcony until the party ended, and the champagne ran out, and the lights in the ballroom dimmed. He didn't give his name. She didn't ask. He told her his father had just died, told it in the dry, broken voice of someone speaking for the first time about something he didn't yet know how to hold. She told him she was studying to become a nurse because she wanted to keep people alive. He laughed for the first time that night when he heard that, a short, tired laugh, but real. And then the night unfolded, the way nights like that do when two lonely people stand close enough for long enough in the dark. The next morning, Bryn woke up alone. He was gone. On the bedside table lay a heavy gold ring with a black stone, set beside a glass of water, as if he had taken it off to wash his hands and forgotten it. Or hadn't. She never knew. She kept the ring, searched for him in every way a 21-year-old student with no money and no connections could search, which meant not at all. She didn't know his name, didn't know what he did, only the black eyes and the scar and the tired laugh on the balcony. 2 months later, she discovered she was pregnant. She kept the baby, dropped out of school, gave birth to Rosie alone at Stroger Public Hospital with the ring tucked in a tin box under the bed, the only keepsake from a man she couldn't find and couldn't forget. The 7 years that followed were 7 years Bryn spent using everything she had to keep the two of them alive. Then her body began to lose. Stage 4, kidney failure. She lost her job because she was too weak to stand full shifts. She lost her insurance because she lost her job. Her Medicaid application submitted 3 months earlier was still pending, buried somewhere in the paperwork of a system that never rushes because it isn't the one dying. The cost of weekly dialysis didn't pause to wait for Medicaid. Bryn borrowed from Ray Kovac, a loan shark operating behind a pawn shop in West Englewood, the only person who would lend to her without insurance or credit, or anything beyond a signature and desperation. The brutal interest turned the loan into a monster 4 times its size within months, and Kovac began coming to the apartment to collect in person, began looking around for anything of value, and began looking at Rosie in a way no mother on earth could witness and still sleep. Dario sat still for a long time, long enough that Nico beside him began counting his boss's breaths because he wasn't sure Dario was still breathing at all. Then Dario leaned back in his chair, oak creaking under his weight, and looked straight at the child standing before him, with the ring held out in her palm like a plea made of gold and stone. "You're not selling this ring," Dario said, his voice low and slow, each word landing heavy as a brick. Not the voice of a man negotiating, but the voice of a man declaring. Rosie blinked. Then she understood, or understood in the way a 7-year-old could understand, that this man was saying no, and that no meant her mother wouldn't have money, the hospital would stop dialysis, Kovac would keep calling, the landlord would evict them, and everything she had crossed tonight, the bus ride, the snowy walk, the heavy oak door, the 20 armed men, would all be meaningless. Panic surged across her face like floodwater. "But I have to," Rosie said, her voice higher, thinner, words beginning to crack. My mom needs money. If there isn't any then." "This ring has no price," Dario cut in, not harshly, just final, the tone he'd used for 14 years to end arguments before they could begin. "Not because it isn't valuable, but because it isn't something that can be sold. It's a keepsake. There are things in this world money can't buy, and no one has the right to put a number on them." Rosie stared at him, blue-gray eyes now full of water, and a child's tears don't fall like an adult's. They don't come slow and silent. They surge and spill all at once with sobs she tried to swallow, but couldn't in time. "Then my mom will die," Rosie said, and the sentence wasn't a question or a plea. It was a simple, brutal statement from a child who had learned to see the world through adult eyes far earlier than any child should. Around the table no one moved, but the air shifted. One man at the far end stared down at his plate, jaw clenched. Another twisted his wedding band without realizing he was doing it. Nico sat beside Dario, staring straight ahead, eyes unblinking, but his jaw ticked once, a tiny movement that only happened when Nico was restraining something powerful inside. Dario looked at the crying child and felt something hot rise in his throat, heat that had nothing to do with the red wine on the table. Blue-gray eyes stared at him through tears. Bryn Holloway's eyes set in a face with a Valenti jaw and Valenti black hair, and Dario saw two worlds collide, the balcony of the Palmer house 7 years ago, and the Englewood studio apartment where a woman lay waiting to die because he'd walked away before dawn. He leaned forward, both forearms on the table, the thorned vine tattoo at his wrist catching candlelight, and met her gaze. "Look at me, Rosie," he said. And it was the first time he'd spoken her name, the first time it had passed his lips, and it felt both strange and right in a way he didn't yet understand. "No one is going to die. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. I promise you." Rosie looked at him, tears still falling, but the sobbing stopped, as if that voice carried enough weight to press a panicking child down and hold her there. She didn't know why she believed this man. She didn't know who he was, what he did, or why the whole room went silent when he spoke. But there was something in his voice, a deep, steady calm she'd never heard in any adult who'd ever spoken to her mother on the phone. A calm that wasn't indifference, but certainty. The calm of someone who had already decided, and it made her want to believe. Dario turned to Nico. "Call Gianna," he said, his voice shifting to another rhythm, the command rhythm the men around this table knew, as well as the sound of their own engines. "Get the cars ready, all of them." Nico didn't ask questions, didn't ask why Gianna, didn't ask how many all meant, didn't ask where they were going. He stood, pulled out his phone, and stepped away from the table. Around the room, chairs slid back, wood scraping marble, keys clinked, suit jackets shifted on shoulders. Short murmurs passed between men transitioning from dinner to readiness. They didn't need details. They only needed Dario's voice to know tonight wasn't ordinary. Dario turned back to Rosie. She was still standing there, her hand still open, the ring still resting in her palm, tears clinging to her chin. He nodded toward the empty chair beside him. "Sit down," he said, his voice softening so much that a few men nearby glanced over because they weren't sure they'd ever heard their boss sound like that. "Put the ring away. It's not for sale. It stays with you." Rosie hesitated, then curled her fingers around the ring, tucked it into her coat pocket, and climbed onto the chair far too tall for her legs dangling above the floor. Dario gestured to the waiter still frozen beside the bar. "Bring her food, anything hot, and a glass of warm milk." Then he took the cashmere scarf from the back of his chair, charcoal-colored, soft, worth more than Bryn's monthly rent, and draped it over Rosie's shoulders. She disappeared into the fabric, one hand still gripping the pocket where the ring lay. "Now," Dario said, his voice still gentle, but his eyes were not. His eyes sharp and focused in the way Nico recognized instantly from across the room, the look Dario wore when he was planning, and nothing on earth would stop that plan from being carried out. You tell me everything. The hospital's name, the doctor's name, where this Kovac is, his phone number, address, anything you remember, the landlord's name, what the red paper on the door says. Every piece of paper on the table at your house, whatever you remember, tell me. Rosie looked at him for a moment. Then she began to speak, and she told him everything. Not the way a normal 7-year-old would tell it, scattered and jumping around, but clearly, carefully, accurately, in order, from Stroger Hospital to the doctor's name, to the dialysis schedule every Tuesday and Friday, to the amount Kovac mentioned on the phone, to the landlord's name, Phil Brennan, to the words on the red notice she'd spelled out in her head, even though she didn't fully understand them. She spoke like a child who had listened to every call, read every envelope, counted every pill in every bottle, and stored every one of her mother's fears, somewhere deep inside, because she understood that if her mother fell, there was no one else to stand up, and if she didn't remember, then no one would remember for her. Dario listened without interrupting, without questions, simply listening, and with every detail she gave, another brick was laid in the wall of anger rising inside him, an anger that wasn't explosive or loud, but cold and slow, the kind that everyone who knew Dario Valenti understood was 100 times more dangerous than any shout. When Dario stepped out of the restaurant, the cold slapped his face like a reminder that the world beyond the oak doors was still turning and freezing, snow clinging to the shoulders of his black suit within seconds, melting into the fabric and soaking through, and he didn't bother brushing it off. 12 black Cadillac Escalades lined the curb with engines already running, headlights cutting through the snowfall into dull yellow columns, exhaust smoke curling up to mix with the cold air and settle low over the street. 20 men had exited before him and now stood beside the vehicles, suit shoulders dusted with snow, no one shivering, no one rushing, simply waiting with the patience of men who had learned how to wait beside Dario Valenti for 14 years. Nico stood by the lead vehicle with his phone to his ear, said something brief, then hung up. Gianna's on the way, Nico said. I told her to bring a full medical kit. Dario nodded and turned to look at Rosie standing just behind him on the restaurant steps, the cashmere scarf wrapped around her shoulders, the oversized coat hanging to her knees, soaked sneakers leaving dark marks on the stone. She stood in the falling snow staring at the glossy black vehicles and the large men in suits forming a living wall around her, her face wearing the expression of someone who wasn't sure if she was awake or dreaming. Nico stepped forward, dropped to one knee in front of Rosie, and draped a fur-lined cashmere coat he'd taken from the trunk around her, long enough to reach her ankles, warm enough that Rosie drew a deep breath not from fear, but because, for the first time that night, her body didn't have to curl in on itself to hold heat. Get in the car, Dario said as he opened the rear door of the first Escalade. Rosie climbed in and sank into soft black leather, warmth from the heater wrapping around her from every side. She placed her hand on the seat, fingers brushing the smooth surface as if touching something that didn't belong to the world she knew. The scent of new leather, expensive cologne, the clean smell of money filled the cabin, everything the opposite of the damp rot and canned soup and pain medication she breathed every day. Dario slid in beside her, shut the door, and tapped twice on the back of the driver's seat. The vehicle pulled away and the other 11 followed, a black serpent gliding through snow. The convoy cut through Chicago at night from the South Loop toward the South Side, crossing invisible borders the wealthy never crossed and the poor never escaped. Streetlights thinned. Buildings sank lower. Bright storefronts vanished, replaced by rusted shutters and dark signs. Sidewalks shifted from smooth stone to cracked concrete. Dario stared through the window, jaw clenched, realizing he controlled half this city, collected protection money from restaurants with glowing glass fronts, laundered cash through buildings staffed by uniformed janitors. Yet he'd never sat in a car looking out at the other side of Chicago, the side where his daughter had lived for 7 years. Turn left at the broken light ahead, Rosie said, her voice small but clear, eyes fixed on the window, past the closed laundromat with the torn green awning, then straight through 2 intersections, the red brick building on the right, the one with the concrete stairs where the 3rd step is broken. She guided them through her neighborhood like reading a map she knew by heart, in the flat, steady voice of a child who had walked these streets too many times. Dario listened, and with each detail, the broken light, the closed laundromat, the cracked step, something inside him took another small cut he didn't yet have a name for. The convoy stopped before a 4-story red brick building, the kind built in the 1950s that Chicago had by the thousands. Bricks flaking, second-floor windows taped over, rusted exterior pipes running up the wall like veins on an aging arm. Snow lay on the sagging awning, on overturned trash cans, on the concrete steps where the third step was indeed broken in half. Dario stepped out, looked up at the building, and saw the red notice taped to the ground floor door fluttering in the wind. He stared at it long enough to read the bold capital letters from a distance, then walked past it without touching it. Not yet. Rosie led him up the stairs, 4 flights. The third-floor bulb burned out, mildew clinging to the walls like a second coat of paint, the hallway floor creaking under Dario's leather shoes. Nico followed, 2 men taking positions at the ground floor, and 2 more at the top of the 4th-floor stairs, no one needing to be told, positions assigned by instinct. Rosie stopped at the last apartment door on the 4th floor, pulled a cord from around her neck with a small brass key attached, and unlocked it. Stale warmth rushed out, not comforting warmth, but the trapped heat of a small room sealed too long, mixed with the smell of medicine, cold canned soup, gas from an old stove, and unwashed bedding because the person lying there no longer had the strength to stand and load the machine. Dario stepped inside and the room closed around him. Small, the ceiling low enough he nearly brushed it, paint peeling to expose gray plaster beneath. A small table against the wall overflowed with envelopes in white, yellow, and pink. And amid them, pill bottles stood in a neat line like sentries. 2 nearly empty, 1 completely empty. An old gas stove held a small flame under a kettle, likely lit before pain medication dragged Bryn into sleep, the habit of someone who always wanted hot water ready for the next dialysis run. And on the bed lay a woman on her side, blanket pulled to her chest, 1 hand resting over her heart. Bryn Holloway, 28 years old, but looking 40, thin to the point her shoulder bones pushed against the thin fabric of her nightgown, skin pale, dark hollows beneath her eyes, and her lips, tinted faintly purple in a way Dario knew wasn't from cold, but from blood that wasn't being properly filtered and was poisoning her from within. "Mom," Rosie called softly, carefully, the voice of a child used to waking someone sick without startling them. "I'm home." Bryn stirred, heavy lids lifting slowly, and the first thing she saw was Rosie beside the bed, wrapped in a floor-length cashmere coat she'd never seen before. The second thing she saw was the silhouette of a man standing in the doorway. Tall, broad-shouldered, black suit filling the frame. His face half-lit and half-shadowed by the flickering hallway bulb. Bryn jerked upright on instinct, clutching the blanket to her chest, eyes wide, pupils shrinking with fear. Then the man stepped fully into the room, and kitchen light fell across his face. Black eyes, a faint scar along the bridge of his nose, a hard jawline. 7 years and illness and debt and sleeplessness had erased many things from Bryn's memory. But not that face, not those eyes, not the scar she had once traced with her fingertip on the Palmer House balcony while he spoke of his father in a dry, broken voice. 7 years collapsed into a single second. The apartment walls vanished. The debt envelopes vanished. The pill bottles vanished. Only those eyes remained, looking at her from the doorway, the same eyes she had searched for in every crowd, on every bus, in every stranger's face for 7 years, and never found. "It's you," Bryn whispered, the words leaving her mouth not as a sentence, but as a breath she had been holding for 7 years. Dario stood there looking at her, at the blue-gray eyes now sunken and rimmed red, at the faintly purple lips, at the fragile hand clutching the blanket, at this cramped room where his daughter and the woman who had given him that daughter had lived for 7 years, while he sat in restaurants eating lobster off gold-rimmed plates. And for the first time in his life, Dario Valenti, the man no one in Chicago dared meet eye to eye, the man who killed without trembling and commanded without losing sleep, stood in the doorway of a ruined studio apartment in Englewood and didn't know what to say. Silence stretched between them in the small studio, heavier than every debt envelope on the table and sharper than every midnight call. Then Bryn's gaze dropped to the cashmere coat on Rosie's shoulders and stopped at the old jacket pocket. Flat now, missing the small bulge she knew should be there. "Rosie," Bryn said, her voice trembling but sharp. "Where is the ring?" Rosie stared at the floor, fingers worrying the hem of her coat. "I took it to sell, so I could pay the doctor, so you wouldn't die." Bryn broke down, the sound tearing out of her from everywhere at once. The cry of a mother who had just realized her 7-year-old daughter had slipped out alone into a Chicago blizzard because she had failed to keep her child a child. She pulled Rosie into her arms, held her tight, cried into her hair, angry at her for risking her life, and angrier at herself for letting things fall this far. Then, over Rosie's shoulder, she saw Dario still standing in the doorway. Bryn's dignity, battered by 7 years of poverty but never killed, rose up. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and met his gaze. "You don't need to be here," Bryn said. "I don't know how you found us, but I don't need pity. I don't need your help. I don't need anyone's." Dario stepped forward, far enough for the kitchen light to fully reveal his face. "This isn't pity," he said, each word carrying its own weight. "Your daughter brought that ring to my restaurant tonight. That ring belonged to my father. It's the only thing he left me, and I spent 7 years trying to find it." He looked at Rosie, then back at Bryn. "A 7-year-old brought my father's ring to me. Black hair like mine, a jaw like mine, and blue-gray eyes like yours." The room seemed to shrink. Bryn stopped breathing. "You're telling me," Dario said, his voice cracking at the edge. "Only a little, just enough that Nico in the hallway turned his face to the wall, that I have a daughter I didn't know about. For 7 years. Silence. Rosie sat on the bed, looking back and forth between her mother and the strange man, not understanding everything but feeling the weight pressing down on the room. Bryn saw the anger in Dario's eyes, saw it coil like fire turned by the wind, but she didn't step back. "I didn't hide her from you," Bryn said, her voice firm though her hand still shook. "I didn't know your name. You didn't tell me. That night you told me your father had just died and I didn't ask your name because I thought it would be cruel. The next morning you were gone. You left nothing but the ring on the bedside table." She swallowed, her chest rising and falling. "I looked for you. I took the ring to jewelers and asked whose crest it was. I asked the Palmer house for guest lists from that night. I searched online for a crowned lion. No one knew, and I was a 21-year-old pregnant student with no money and no connections. I searched with everything I had, and everything I had wasn't enough." Dario listened, and with each sentence another door closed in front of the anger that had been aimed at her. She hadn't hidden, she hadn't known. She had searched and failed because his world, the Mafia world, the world of parties without guest lists and crests ordinary jewelers didn't recognize, was built precisely so outsiders couldn't find their way in. He had protected himself so well that the woman carrying his child couldn't find him for 7 years. The anger turned inward, toward himself, toward the morning he left the hotel room before dawn without leaving a name, toward the 7 years he'd lived in a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, while his daughter slept on a mattress on the floor of an apartment without heat. He closed his eyes for a second, then opened them. And when he did, Bryn saw something change. The anger compressed into something harder and sharper, something with the shape of a decision. "I'll fix everything," Dario said. "The hospital, the loan shark, the landlord, every piece of paper on that table. Every midnight call, all of it. Tonight." Bryn looked at him, instinctive defense flaring. "I can't owe you." Dario held her gaze, looking into the unbroken blue-gray eyes that 7 years of illness hadn't crushed, and in that moment, he understood why the child on the bed could walk through a blizzard and stand before 20 armed men without shaking, because her mother was this woman. Then he said, in the voice that made half of Chicago tremble but now sounded almost impossibly gentle. Gentle enough it hardly seemed to belong to the same man. "You don't owe me, Bryn. I'm the one who owes you. 7 years." Dario left Bryn's apartment 15 minutes after saying those words, leaving 2 of his men outside the door, one at the top of the stairwell and one at the ground floor steps, then stepped back into the falling snow. Nico was already waiting beside the lead vehicle with his phone in hand. Everything arranged in the time Dario had spent inside with Bryn. "Kovac," Dario said, a single word, and Nico nodded because he had known that name would be first. Not the hospital, not the landlord. Kovac. Because on Dario's list tonight, Kovac wasn't just a creditor. Kovac was the man who had spoken Rosie's name on the phone and sent Bryn clutching her chest for breath. Kovac was the man who had looked at his daughter in a way Rosie didn't understand, but Bryn did, and Dario did. 8 Escalades split from the convoy, 4 remaining in front of the red brick building. The smaller line drove 4 blocks west and stopped before a pawn shop in West Englewood, the one with the flickering green neon cash sign, iron bars over the glass, and security cameras mounted at the ceiling corners with half of them broken. The lights inside were still on. Kovac worked late. Men like Kovac always did. Because money doesn't sleep, and neither do people who owe it. 8 Escalades line the curb, engines running, headlights blasting straight into the storefront. The men stepped out, 12 of them, forming a line along the sidewalk, arms folded, snow settling on their shoulders. No one talking, no one smoking, just standing there like a living steel barrier. Dario got out, adjusted his cuff, and walked straight into the shop. Nico followed with a brown paper envelope in hand. The bell rang as the glass door opened. Inside smelled of stale cigarettes, metal, cheap plastic, shelves packed with old electronics, dusty instruments, and costume jewelry. The counter was shielded by wire mesh, and behind it sat a man in his mid-40s with thinning hair, greasy skin, a faded gray shirt, and a beer belly pressed against the counter edge. Ray Kovac. He looked up at the bell, saw Dario, and took exactly 3 seconds to recognize who was standing in front of him. The smile on Kovac's face died and returned almost at the same time, the smile of someone calculating fast and deciding that acting unafraid was the best option. "Mr. Valenti," Kovac said, forcing casual. "What an honor. How can I help?" Dario didn't sit. There was no chair in that shop for him, and he didn't sit across from men like this. He stood at the counter, looking down through the wire, and said flatly, "Bryn Holloway, how much principal does she owe you?" Kovac blinked, licked his lips, fingers tapping lightly on the counter. "Holloway, she owes me quite a bit. Principal plus interest plus late fees comes to principal," Dario cut in, his voice level as the countertop. "I didn't ask about interest. I didn't ask about fees. How much principal? You take it. You wipe the interest. You close the file." Kovac looked at Dario, then at Nico behind him, then through the glass at the 12 silhouettes standing in the snow, then back at Dario. He laughed, short and soft, the laugh of a man used to bullying the weak who thinks he still has room to negotiate. "Mr. Valenti, I respect you, but this is a loan contract. There's a signature. There are terms. Interest is interest. I can't just erase it because someone sent you here. That's business." Dario didn't repeat himself. He never repeated himself. He only tilted his head slightly toward Nico, a movement so small you'd miss it if you blinked. Nico stepped forward, placed the brown envelope on the counter directly in front of Kovac, then stepped back. Kovac stared at it, then at Nico, then at Dario, then opened it. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, clear shots from multiple angles on different days. Kovac collecting cash off the books. Kovac moving illegal goods through the back door at night. Kovac meeting people he shouldn't meet in places he shouldn't be. Each photo stamped with date, time, and location. 2 years' worth. Enough for 20 years in prison. The blood drained from Kovac's face. The smile vanished, and this time it didn't come back. "You take the principal," Dario said, calm as if reading a menu. "You erase the interest. You close the Holloway file. You write a confirmation now that she owes nothing." Kovac opened his mouth to say something, maybe to bargain, maybe to beg for time, but Dario wasn't finished. "And there's one more thing," Dario said, his voice dropping half a tone, a change so slight that Nico crossed his arms tighter, because he knew that tone, the one Dario used when the line between warning and action was razor thin. "I know how you looked at that child. I know because the child told me, and her mother told me, and I believe them. If you look at her again, if you say her name again, if you pass by her school or stand anywhere near where she is, this envelope will land in the right hands at the county police." Dario paused, tilting his head, eyes black and bottomless. "Or it will land in mine. Either way, you won't enjoy it." Kovac didn't laugh. He didn't meet Dario's eyes. He picked up a pen, his hand shaking so badly that the signature on the debt release form came out like a child's first attempt at writing. He pushed the paper through the mesh. Nico took it, folded it, slipped it into his suit jacket. Dario turned and walked out without another word. The bell rang again as the glass door closed. Kovac sat alone behind the counter, with the envelope of photos still open before him, his hands still trembling, and through the blinds he could see 12 figures standing in the snow, arms folded, shoulders white, patient but not endless. From Kovac's pawnshop, Dario didn't return to Bryn's apartment. He had one more stop before the night ended. The convoy reduced to 2 vehicles, one for Dario and Nico, one for 2 men following, while the remaining 6 returned to guard the red brick building. Dario didn't need 8 Escalades to meet a landlord. Phil Brennan lived in a 2-story house 4 blocks north of Englewood in Bridgeport, where the streets were a little cleaner and the streetlights still worked. His office was on the ground floor, with a private entrance and a small sign that read, Brennan Property Management, in peeling letters. The upstairs light was on, which meant Brennan wasn't asleep. Dario stepped onto the stoop and knocked. Not hard, not hurried, just 3 even knocks. The knock of someone with time to spare because he knew the door would open. Slippers shuffled inside, a lock turned, and the door opened to Phil Brennan in an old t-shirt and plaid sleep pants, gray hair mussed, eyes narrowed at 2 men in suits, standing on his doorstep near 2 a.m, with snow falling. Brennan was 60, owned 7 rental buildings in Englewood and back of the yards. The kind of landlord who collected rent on time and never fixed the heat on time, the kind who made money off people with no other choices. Bryn Holloway, Building 4412, South Ashland, 4th floor. Dario said, no greeting, no introduction, straight to the point, the way he entered everything. How many months does she owe you? Brennan looked at Dario, then at Nico behind him, then at the black Escalade parked outside his house. And the survival instinct of a man who'd lived on the south side long enough told him this was the moment to answer. 3 months, Brennan said. 3 months overdue. I sent the legal notice. The red paper on the door, Dario said. Not a question. Brennan nodded. Dario reached into the inside pocket of his suit and pulled out a thick white envelope. He opened it and counted in front of Brennan. Bill by bill. Cash. $100 notes. Slow and exact. 3 months back, rent plus 6 months prepaid, 9 months total. Count it. He set the stack on the small counter by the door. Brennan looked at the money, looked at Dario, then counted. It was right. Every bill. In exchange, Dario said, you fix her heat this week. The bedroom window that leaks gets sealed. The front door lock gets replaced. And the red paper on the ground floor door comes down before noon tomorrow. Brennan nodded through each point, reached for the receipt book on the shelf, and started writing. Large cash payments weren't unusual here. Small Englewood landlords took cash often, but 9 months of rent, paid at once in hundreds in the middle of the night by 2 men in suits, was something Brennan hadn't seen in 30 years of renting. He tore off the receipt and handed it over. Dario folded it and slipped it into his jacket. Then Brennan asked, not from curiosity but from instinct, the kind of question any landlord asks when a stranger pays for a tenant. Are you family? Dario paused for a beat. Just one. Short. But in that beat were 7 years he hadn't known. A child's soaked sneakers cutting through snow. Gray-green eyes lifted over a palm holding a ring. Bryn's voice saying it's you in a dark studio smelling of medicine and canned soup. I'm her family, Dario said. And his voice then wasn't the boss's voice. Wasn't the voice he'd used on Kovac 15 minutes earlier. It was softer, truer, and it made Brennan nod once more and close the door without another question. At 6 the next morning, when the snow stopped and Chicago woke under a white cover, Dario's private attorney, a silver-haired man in a gray suit and polished shoes, walked into Stroger Hospital's billing department as the doors opened. He carried a prepared bank check, a power of attorney signed by Dario, and a clear list of instructions. Pay all outstanding balances for patient Bryn Holloway, including accumulated dialysis costs, lab fees, consultation fees, and every ad on the American healthcare system excelled at creating and hiding in the smallest print possible. Enroll Bryn in long-term dialysis with payment guaranteed 12 months in advance. Place her name on the priority kidney transplant waiting list at Northwestern Memorial, and record in the patient file under support system 2 words that made the staff glance at one another and ask nothing further. Yes, complete. The billing clerk entered the check, and on the screen, the debt column for Bryn Holloway, the red column that had flashed like a warning light for 3 months every time her file was opened, turned to 0. Red disappeared. The screen went white. Clean, as if 7 years of drowning had just been pulled to the surface by a very large and very steady hand that Bryn didn't yet know had always been closer than she thought. Dario returned to the red brick building close to 8 in the morning. The snow had stopped, but the sky remained gray, that heavy Chicago winter gray when the sun rises and still refuses to show itself. He climbed the 4 flights of stairs, passing the 2 men still posted on the ground floor and the second floor, his leather shoes striking the concrete steps in the empty hallway. When he reached the 4th floor, he stopped in front of Bryn's apartment and looked at the red paper still taped to the wooden door. He stared at it for a moment, rereading the block letters he had already read the night before, the eviction notice, the words Rosie had said her mother read, and then sat down on the kitchen floor for a long time without getting back up. Then Dario raised his hand, gripped the corner of the paper, and tore it off the door in one clean, decisive pull, ripping away tape and a strip of old paint with it. He folded the paper in half and slipped it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket beside Brennan's receipt and Kovac's debt clearance. 3 pieces of paper. 3 problems. Finished. He knocked softly and opened the door. Inside, Bryn was sitting propped against the bed frame, Rosie curled beside her, the two of them holding each other beneath an old blanket and the cashmere coat Nico had draped over the girl the night before. Bryn looked up when the door opened, her eyes swollen and red, not from crying but from not sleeping, from lying awake all night holding her daughter and staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was dreaming. Dario stepped in, pulled the only chair in the room over to face the bed, and sat down. His knees nearly touched the mattress in a room so small the distance between them was no more than an arm's length. He looked at Bryn and began to speak, without embellishment or explanation, just reporting results the way he always did with Nico after a job. Kovac is done. He took the principal, wiped the interest, signed the paper that you owe nothing. He won't call again. He won't come by again. He won't say Rosie's name again. Bryn looked at him, her lips parting but no words coming out. The landlord is done. Brennan took full payment, 3 months back plus 6 months prepaid. The heat will be fixed this week, the window sealed, new locks, and the red paper on the door. He reached into his jacket and set the folded notice down on the table beside the stack of overdue envelopes. I took it down. The hospital is done. My lawyer went to Stroger this morning, paid all outstanding balances. You're enrolled in long-term dialysis, and your name has been placed on the priority kidney transplant list at Northwestern Memorial. Bryn didn't speak. She just sat there, back against the bed, arms around Rosie, and cried. But these tears were different. Not the tears of nights spent alone listening to Kovac threaten over the phone. Not the tears of the morning she read the red paper and sank to the kitchen floor because she couldn't stand anymore. These tears were lighter, warmer, falling without sound. The tears of someone hearing for the first time in 7 years that everything would be all right and believing it was true. Rosie held her mother tighter, her face pressed into Bryn's neck, saying nothing, just holding on with her small arms the way she had held on for 7 years. The room was silent, except for breathing and tears. Then Dario reached into the coat Rosie had taken off and left on the chair and pulled out the gold ring. He held it in his palm and slowly turned it under the weak light of the studio, the onyx catching the glow, the lion crest flickering. He looked at it for a long moment, his thumb brushing the scratch on the right edge his father had left when he slammed his hand on an oak table 30 years earlier. My father's name was Lorenzo Valenti, Dario said, his voice soft and slow, a voice he'd never used with anyone except Nico. He wore this ring every day for 30 years. He said it was the backbone of the Valenti line, where my grandfather's soul lived, where his soul lived, where every man who built this family lived. He died when I was 23. I wore it after that, and I lost it 7 years ago. He looked up at Rosie, who was staring at him with wide gray-green eyes. He placed the ring in her small palm and folded her fingers around the black stone. You keep it, Dario said. Your grandfather's ring. When you're sad, when you're scared, when you think no one's coming, look at it and remember that someone will come. Rosie closed her hand around the ring, feeling its weight, heavier than its size should allow. She looked down at the lion crest, then back up at the man sitting across from her, the man with the same black hair and jaw as hers. Who are you? Rosie asked, her voice small, not afraid, just wanting to know. Dario looked at Bryn. Bryn looked back at him, eyes full of tears, and nodded, just once, very lightly, but in that nod was a permission she hadn't been able to give 7 years ago, and was giving now with tears and with a fragile faith that this time would be different. Dario turned back to Rosie, and his voice broke. For the first time that night, for the first time in many years, breaking not from weakness but from something too large trying to escape a space too small. I'm your dad, Rosie. 3 words fell into the room like the first drops before a storm. Rosie looked at him, looked at her mother. Her mother nodded, tears streaming, lips pressed tight to hold back a sob. Rosie looked back at Dario, then let the ring fall into her lap, slid off the bed, and threw her arms around him. Her small arms wrapped around his neck, her face pressed into his black suit jacket, her whole body shaking, not from cold. Dario held his daughter for the first time in his life. The arms that had done things the dark never told now held a 7-year-old child, light and warm and real. So real he couldn't breathe. He slid off the chair to the floor, knees hitting cold tile, held Rosie tighter, and cried, silently, tears running down the face of the man Chicago wouldn't meet the eyes of, now sitting on the floor of a broken studio apartment in Englewood, holding the daughter he hadn't known he had, and crying for the first time since the day his father fell on the church steps, 14 years earlier. 1 hour after Dario held his daughter for the first time on the floor of that apartment, everything began to change. His men carried things up the stairs trip by trip without being told, each of them knowing exactly what to do because they had seen their boss cry, and that alone made everything a top priority. Hot food from Valenti's arrived in insulated containers. Pasta, minestrone soup, crusty warm bread, the kind of food Rosie had only ever seen through restaurant windows on the street. New blankets, thick and soft, without the smell of damp. A compact electric heater plugged in and began blowing warmth into the room for the first time that winter. Medication, the right kind and the right dosage. Nico had called Dr. Gianna for prescriptions before stopping at a 24-hour pharmacy on the way back. Gianna arrived at 9 in the morning. The Valenti family's private physician, 35 years old, dark hair pulled into a neat bun, sharp eyes, gentle hands with anything but a gentle level of expertise. She examined Bryn at the bedside, took her blood pressure, checked the bruising on her arms where dialysis needles had gone in again and again, listened to her heart and lungs, and made precise notes in small, exact handwriting. She laid out a new treatment plan, adjusted medications, set a dialysis schedule, and told Bryn plainly, without softening the truth, that her body had been pushed to its limit, but not past it, that there was still time, still a chance, if everything was done right from now on. While Gianna worked, one of the men, Marco, stood in the corner waiting for instructions, his eyes scanning the small studio until they stopped at the wall near the kitchen. Rosie had taped up 4 or 5 crayon drawings there, folded letter-size paper edged with tape. Every drawing showed 2 people. Only 2. One tall figure with long hair, and one small figure with curls, standing by a house, standing by a tree, standing together on a bus. There was never a third figure. Marco looked at the drawings, then turned his face toward the wall as if checking an outlet, his shoulder giving a small involuntary shake he hoped no one noticed. At noon, Dario told Bryn he wanted to take her and Rosie to his penthouse, on the 42nd floor overlooking Lake Michigan. Safe, spacious, warm, with security, with everything. Bryn looked him straight in the eye and said she wasn't a decoration in his home, that Rosie needed stability, not a stranger's palace, that the child needed to go to her old school on time, see her old friends, have her own room for the first time in her life, not wake up in a Mafia boss's penthouse less than 12 hours after meeting him. Dario looked at her and, instead of arguing, nodded, because he realized she was right, and because he was beginning to understand that Bryn Holloway wasn't someone he could give orders to. That afternoon, Nico found a 2-bedroom apartment in Bridgeport, 4 blocks from Rosie's school, 3rd floor. Clean, working heat, sealed windows, new locks, in a building where Dario would station 2 men on the ground floor around the clock and keep an Escalade parked permanently outside. When Dario showed Bryn the photos on his phone, she studied them carefully, swiping through each one, then said it was fine. For Rosie, not for him and her. Dario nodded again. He understood that boundary. He accepted it, and somewhere deep inside, he knew that the fact she drew that line was exactly why he respected her. 3 months passed, and Dario Valenti learned that building an empire with blood and iron was far easier than being the father of a 7-year-old girl. In the first week, he came to the new apartment every day, bringing food, bringing flowers, bringing expensive toys that Rosie politely thanked him for, and then set aside untouched. Bryn watched him from the kitchen and said nothing, but her eyes made it clear that money couldn't buy what that child needed. He understood in the 2nd week, when Bryn told him Rosie liked reading. After that, every visit came with a book, chosen from a bookstore along Michigan Avenue. Dario asking the clerk which one was right for a 7-year-old girl, standing in the children's section, in a black 3-piece suit among mothers in jeans and hoodies, never feeling out of place because Dario Valenti had never felt out of place anywhere. Rosie began to wait for him, not for food or toys, for books, and for the way he sat down on the floor beside her, back against the wall, long legs stretched out. Reading with her in that low voice she said sounded like a car engine idling slowly on the road, a sound Rosie liked. In the second month, Rosie's school held its spring piano recital. Dario sat in the very last row of the small auditorium, black three-piece suit among parents in cheap jackets and denim, Nico standing by the door with his arms folded, looking like a presidential bodyguard. Rosie sat at the old upright piano on stage, hands on the keys, scanning the audience for her mother. She found her in the third row. Then her eyes drifted farther back, past the fourth row, the fifth, all the way to the last row, and she saw him. Dario sat there, back straight, hands resting on his knees, watching her. Rosie smiled. For the first time on stage, for the first time in front of a crowd, a small, quick smile meant only for the man in the back row. Then she turned back to the keys and played. He took Rosie out for ice cream every Saturday, helped with homework every Wednesday evening, even though it was Nico who actually managed to solve second-grade science problems, because Dario stared at the photosynthesis diagram in the textbook, the way he'd stare at a nuclear weapons blueprint, with total incomprehension, and Rosie had to cover her mouth to laugh when Uncle Nico sat on the floor with a pencil, explaining how plants eat sunlight, while her father sat at the kitchen table drinking espresso and pretending to read the paper. But the most important moments didn't happen during the day. They happened at night, after Rosie fell asleep, when the apartment was quiet, and Dario sat at the kitchen table across from Bryn, 2 cups of tea between them, and they talked. The conversations started short and careful, then grew longer and deeper with each passing week. Dario talked about his father, about the day he fell on the steps of St. Ignatius Church, about inheriting the empire at 23 and building it through violence and other people's fear, about the price he paid each night lying in his penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, knowing the silence around him wasn't peace, but loneliness. Bryn talked about 7 years alone, about nights crying while holding Rosie after she fell asleep because she didn't know where the money for the doctor would come from the next day, about the ring in the tin box that she hated because it reminded her of the Palmer House balcony night, but could never sell because it was the only proof that Rosie had a father, that night was real, that her daughter hadn't come from nothing. One night, somewhere deep into a conversation she'd lost count of, Bryn finished a sentence and then stopped, tears spilling over that she didn't wipe away because she was too tired to hide anymore. Dario reached across the table and brushed the tear from her cheek with his thumb, slow and careful, like he was touching something that might shatter. Bryn closed her hand around his wrist, not to push him away, to keep him there. She looked straight into his eyes and said, "Don't touch me if you're going to disappear again." Dario didn't pull his hand back. He looked at her, into those gray-green eyes he'd left behind on a hotel pillow 7 years earlier, and said, "I'm a bad man, Bryn. I do things you don't want to know about, but I'm a bad man who won't ever disappear from you and Rosie again. No kiss, no grand promise, just bare truth laid out between 2 cups of cooling tea on the kitchen table of a 2-bedroom apartment in Bridgeport." And Bryn held his gaze long enough to know that this time, she wanted to believe. Rumors in Chicago's underworld spread like fire on oil. Dario Valenti had a daughter, 7 years old, living in Bridgeport with her mother. No one knew exactly where the leak came from. Maybe a soldier who drank too much in the wrong bar. Maybe a Stroger hospital clerk who saw the Valenti name on a payment form. Maybe Brennan telling a neighbor about the man in a suit who paid 9 months of rent in the middle of the night. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the Castellano family knew, and they saw an opportunity. The call came to Bryn's phone on a Tuesday afternoon while she was in the kitchen of the new apartment washing glasses after lunch. An unknown number. She answered, thinking it might be the hospital. A male voice, low, calm, unfamiliar, said only one sentence. "Your daughter looks very pretty in blue today at school," then hung up. Bryn stood there holding the phone as the glass slipped from her hand and shattered in the sink, breaking into 3 pieces she didn't hear. Rosie was wearing blue today, the new outfit Dario had bought her the week before. She called Dario. He answered on the first ring because he always answered Bryn on the first ring. She told him, her voice shaking so badly the words blurred together, and Dario listened. He was silent for 3 seconds after she finished. 3 seconds. Nico stood beside him in the office and saw his boss's face change in those 3 seconds, and he recognized something he had never seen in 14 years at Dario Valenti's side. Fear. Real fear. Not the kind felt when a rival pulled a gun or when federal agents knocked on the door, but the fear of a man who had just realized the only thing in his life he couldn't survive losing was being threatened. The 3 seconds ended, and Dario became someone else. The fear didn't vanish. It was compressed, forced down, locked away deep, and what rose in its place was Valenti at his purest, cold, precise, ruthless. No negotiation, no warnings, no second chances. He spoke to Bryn in a calm that was terrifying. Don't take Rosie to school tomorrow. Don't leave the apartment. Don't open the door for anyone except Nico. Then he hung up and turned to Nico. Castellano, he said, one word, and Nico nodded. Because in this world, there was only one family reckless enough to touch what belonged to Dario Valenti. The next 48 hours were 48 hours no one in Chicago's underworld would ever speak of later in words, only in looks and shaken heads. No one knew exactly what Dario did, who he met, what he said, what he threatened, or which lines he crossed. All anyone knew was that at the end of those 48 hours, Victor Castellano, the rival boss, sent an envelope to Dario's office containing a handwritten formal apology on paper bearing the Castellano crest, along with a pledge that the name Rosie Holloway would never again appear in any conversation involving anyone connected to the Castellano family. The warning spread faster than the original rumor. Don't mention the child. Don't mention the mother. Don't look. Don't ask. Don't think about them. A forbidden zone. Dario Valenti had drawn a circle around those two, and anyone who stepped inside wouldn't step back out. That night, at 3 a.m, Dario went to the Bridgeport apartment. He didn't call ahead. The men downstairs opened the door. He went up the stairs, used the spare key Bryn had given him the week before, and entered quietly. The apartment was dark. Rosie slept in her own room, blanket pulled to her chin, the Valenti ring resting on the bedside table beside a glass of water and the book she hadn't finished. Dario sat down on the floor next to his daughter's bed, back against the wall, legs stretched out, and watched her sleep. He watched her small chest rise and fall. He watched her hand clutch the edge of the blanket. He watched the dark curls spread across the pillow. He stayed there until the first light of morning slipped through the curtains, not sleeping, not looking away, guarding his daughter's sleep with the eyes of a man who had just seen the darkness nearly touch the only bright thing left in his life. Bryn woke at 5 a.m. out of habit, walked down the hallway, saw Rosie's door slightly open, and stopped in the doorway. She saw Dario sitting on the floor beside their daughter's bed, suit rumpled, hair disordered, eyes red from no sleep but wide open and fully alert, and she understood. She understood that this man would burn the entire city to the ground if anyone touched the child sleeping there, and that knowledge frightened her because of the violence he carried like breath, because of the world he belonged to, and at the same time made her feel safe for the first time in 7 years. A kind of safety. No lock, no amount of money, no door could ever give her, only the presence of someone willing to stay awake all night to guard his child's sleep. The Castellano threat had barely ended when Bryn's body began to fail faster than anyone had expected. Gianna called Dario on a Thursday afternoon, her voice calm but her pace quicker than usual, and Dario had stood beside her long enough to know when that calm was real and when it was only a shell. This week's test results showed Bryn's kidney function dropping far faster than projected. Dialysis was keeping her alive, but not for much longer. She needed a transplant, and the waiting list at Northwestern Memorial was so long that the average wait was 3 to 5 years, time Bryn didn't have. "We need a compatible living donor," Gianna said. "That's the fastest way. The only way." Dario tested first. No one had to ask. No one had to suggest it. He sat down in the testing chair at Northwestern Memorial the next morning, rolled up his shirt sleeve, watched the needle slide into his vein, and waited. The results came back 2 days later. Not compatible. Blood type matched, but tissue antigens didn't. Bryn's body would reject his kidney. Dario read the results on the page in Gianna's office and clenched the paper until it crumpled in his hand. He stood, stepped to Gianna's desk, and planted both fists on the wooden surface, with a weight that would have shattered it if he hadn't held back. Nico stood in the doorway watching his boss bend over the desk, shoulders shaking, jaw locked. And for the second time in his life, he saw Dario Valenti powerless. The first time had been the Castellano call. This was worse. This time there was no enemy to eliminate, no door to kick down, no envelope of evidence to drop on a table. This enemy was biology, and biology wasn't afraid of a Mafia boss. Rosie was tested too. Too young to donate, the doctors explained from the start. But Dario wanted the DNA test done at the same time, and Rosie agreed, because she agreed to anything that might save her mother. The DNA results came back the same day as Rosie's compatibility report. On the paper was a line Dario read 3 times. Paternity confirmed with a probability of 99.97%. He had known since the restaurant night, from her eyes, her hair, her jawline, the way she tilted her head. But seeing it on paper, in ink, backed by science, by something no one could deny, made him sit down on a hospital hallway chair and close his eyes for a long time. Gianna sent out a living donor request through the medical network she had access to. But before it reached anyone, Tommaso Valenti called Dario. Uncle Tommaso, 63 years old, his father's younger brother, the retired family advisor who had sat at the far end of the table the night Rosie walked into the restaurant and recognized his brother's ring instantly, without saying a word. Tommaso spoke briefly on the phone, his voice rough with age but firm. "I want to be tested." Dario went silent. "Uncle." "My niece needs her mother," Tommaso said, cutting him off with the authority only a man who had once held Dario as a newborn could wield. "I'm old. 1 kidney is enough. Schedule it." Tommaso's test results came back 3 days later. Compatible. Blood type matched, tissue antigens matched, all indicators within safe range. Gianna called Dario with the news, and for the first time she heard a breath released on the other end of the line. The breath of someone just thrown a lifeline in open water. The transplant took place at Northwestern Memorial on a Monday morning. Tommaso lay on the gurney being wheeled into surgery, looked at Dario standing beside him, and said your father would be proud. "Now leave me alone. I need some sleep." Bryn lay on a gurney in the next room, Rosie holding her hand until a nurse gently eased the girl's fingers away. Dario stood in the hallway watching the 2 operating room doors close at the same time, and waited. 4 hours. Nico stood beside him, silent. Dario didn't sit, didn't eat, didn't drink, just stared at the doors. Then Gianna stepped out, removed her mask, and nodded. 1 nod. Enough. It worked. Bryn opened her eyes, and the first thing she saw wasn't the white hospital ceiling or the neon lights, but a hand. A large hand, long fingers, a thorned vine tattoo at the wrist, holding hers, holding tight but gentle, the kind of grip from someone more afraid of letting go than of anything else in the world. She turned her head to the left, slowly, her neck still stiff from anesthesia, and saw Dario sitting in the plastic hospital chair pulled close to the bed. His suit was rumpled, his white shirt undone at the top 2 buttons, his tie coiled on the table beside a cup of cold coffee, stubble shadowing his jaw from 2 days without shaving. His dark eyes watched her, rimmed red from lack of sleep, and when she opened her eyes she saw his fingers tremble, just slightly. But they trembled. Something no one in his empire was ever allowed to see, no one except Nico standing out in the hallway, and Rosie curled up in the armchair in the corner of the room, knees drawn to her chest, the Valenti ring resting in her small palm even in sleep. "You don't need to stay here the whole time," Bryn said, her voice rough and weak, but her eyes were clear and awake, and still as steady as every other time she looked at him. Dario didn't release her hand. "I know," he said, "but I want to." Bryn studied him for a long moment, looking into the dark eyes she had first seen on the Palmer House balcony 7 years ago. Eyes that were both cold and shattered at the same time. Eyes she had asked a question that night, and he had answered with a lie. "The Palmer House balcony," Bryn said softly. "That night I asked if you were afraid of anything. You said no." Dario met her gaze without turning away, without smiling. "You lied," Bryn said, not in anger, just laying the truth between them, the kind of truth that 7 years and a surgery and a child sleeping in the corner had earned her the right to speak. Dario was silent for a moment. The monitor beside her bed counted Bryn's heartbeat steadily, the soft beeping like a clock counting down to something waiting to be said. "I lied," Dario said, his voice low and slow, each word like he was removing a piece of armor he had worn for 14 years. "I was afraid. I was afraid of this, afraid of having someone to lose. That night I was so afraid I left before dawn because I thought, if I didn't know your name then losing you wouldn't hurt. I was wrong." He looked down at their joined hands, his thumb brushing gently over the back of Bryn's thin hand where the IV bandage still was. "I was wrong for 7 years. Bryn tightened her grip on his hand, with the strength of someone who had just come through a 4-hour kidney transplant, which meant not much, but enough for Dario to feel it. She looked straight into his eyes and said, "Then don't lose me." 3 words. Not forgiveness, not a promise, just a door opening. Small, barely wide enough for one person to step through if that person truly wanted to. Dario bent down. Slowly. Very slowly. As if he were giving her time to turn away if she wanted to. She didn't. He pressed his lips to hers. Light. So light it was almost not a kiss, but a question. She lifted her hand to the back of his neck, fingers sliding into his dark, disheveled hair, and held him there. Their first kiss lasted 3 heartbeats on the monitor. Slow and gentle, painful, with 7 years of loss held between their mouths, and healing because that distance had finally been crossed. In the corner of the room, Rosie shifted in the armchair, still asleep, her fingers clenched around her grandfather's ring, unaware that the man she had carried that ring to find on a snowy night had just kissed her mother for the first time in 7 years. 5 months passed and Bryn Holloway lived. Not lived in the sense of merely surviving day to day like she had for the previous 7 years. Counting pills, counting dollars, counting breaths as if each one might be the last, but truly lived. Tommaso's kidney worked as if it had been born to reside in her body. Recovery markers that Gianna said were better than over 90% of the transplant cases she had ever seen. The first week, Bryn could walk from the bed to the hospital room door. The second week, she could walk the length of the hallway. By the second month, she was back in the Bridgeport apartment, cooking breakfast for Rosie herself for the first time in nearly a year. By the third month, color returned to her cheeks. The purplish tint faded from her lips. And one morning, Rosie looked at her and said she looked like the mom in the old photos. The photos from before the illness. And Bryn had to turn toward the stove because she didn't want her daughter to see her cry over a compliment. By the 5th month, Bryn re-enrolled in the nursing program at Malcolm X College, the very place she had dropped out of 7 years earlier. She went to class in the mornings when Rosie went to school, came home in the afternoons when Rosie did, and in the evenings, she sat at the kitchen table doing homework while Rosie sat across from her doing the same. Both of them bent over their books with a small desk lamp glowing between them like a miniature lighthouse. A year later, she graduated, her nursing degree in hand, standing at the commencement ceremony in a blue gown. And in the audience, Rosie sat between Dario and Nico, clapping louder than anyone else in the hall. Dario clapping more slowly but with a light in his eyes that Nico, standing beside him, recognized and had to look away from because some things were private, even in a crowd. Bryn moved into Dario's penthouse that fall, not because he asked, but because one evening, Rosie was drawing at the dining table in the Bridgeport apartment, looked up at her mother, and asked why her dad wasn't there every night. And Bryn looked at her daughter and then at the phone on the table where Dario's name appeared 3 times a day. And she knew that the boundary she had drawn 7 months earlier had done its job. It had protected her long enough for her to trust. And now, it could be erased. Rosie had her own room for the first time in her life. A large room with windows overlooking Lake Michigan. A bookshelf Dario built by hand, because Nico said building it yourself mattered, even if the result was a little crooked, and Rosie had to slide a thick book under the right leg so it wouldn't tilt. On her wall, beside the old drawings from the Englewood apartment, Rosie hung a new one. Crayon on letter-size paper. 3 people. A tall woman with long hair, a small curly-haired child, and for the first time, a third figure, tall, dark-haired, standing beside them. Marco, the enforcer who had once turned his face to the wall when he saw the 2-person drawings in the Englewood studio, now stood guard outside the penthouse every day. And every time he passed Rosie's room and saw the drawing of 3 people on the wall, he walked 1 step faster, because some things, if you look at them too long, you won't be able to keep your face. The Valenti ring rested in a small glass case on the living room mantel, beside the only family photograph they had, taken at Grant Park in the spring. Rosie sitting on Dario's shoulders, Bryn standing beside him, all 3 smiling. And if you looked closely, you could see at the far left edge of the photo a black-suited arm, because Nico had tried to stay out of frame, but hadn't pulled his hand back in time before the camera clicked. Rosie still took the ring out of the case whenever she felt sad, whenever she felt scared, whenever she had a hard test, or when kids at school asked why there were always 2 men in black suits standing outside the gate to pick her up. She held the ring in her palm, felt the cold metal warm with her body heat, and remembered that this ring had carried her through a snowstorm, through an oak door, past 20 armed men, to the exact person she needed to find. Every winter, on the anniversary of the night Rosie walked into the restaurant, Dario closed Valenti's to the public. No reservations, no guests, no one but family allowed inside. The long banquet table was still laid with white cloth, white candles burning evenly, crystal gleaming, but the chairs were no longer filled only with men in suits carrying guns. Rosie sat in the same seat at the head of the table, where she had once stood trembling, and held out the ring, her feet now touching the floor. Nico sat beside her, still in a black suit, still with his arms crossed, but smiling because Rosie was telling a story from school that she knew only Uncle Nico would laugh at. Tommaso sat at the opposite end, fingers smoothing his napkin, telling old stories about Dario's father, in a gravelly voice everyone had heard dozens of times, but no one interrupted, because that was the privilege of the man who had given up a kidney. And in the middle of the table, Bryn and Dario sat side by side, shoulders touching, hands intertwined beneath the white tablecloth, unseen by anyone else, but fully known to both of them. Many years later, on a winter evening, Rosie sat in the living room of the 42nd floor penthouse, overlooking Lake Michigan, her back against the sofa, knees drawn up, holding the gold ring she had just taken from the glass case on the mantel. She was no longer the 7-year-old child in an oversized coat walking through a snowstorm, but every time she closed her hand around the ring, felt the cold metal warm slowly in her palm. Everything felt as if it had happened only yesterday. The Halstead bus stop, the rush of heat when the doors opened, soaked sneakers, the heavy oak door, 20 silent men, and the sharp black eyes of the man seated at the end of the table watching her walk toward him without signaling anyone to stop her. She traced her finger over the scratch on the right edge left by her grandfather 30 years earlier, and she tried to put into words what she had understood for a long time but had never said aloud, that heroes do not always wear capes. Sometimes they wear black 3-piece suits, arms inked with tattoos, a faint scar along the bridge of the nose, and drive 12 black vehicles through a snowstorm in the middle of the night because a child carrying a ring walked into their restaurant. Sometimes they are a 63-year-old uncle who lies down on an operating table and gives up a kidney without a second of hesitation. Sometimes they are the man in a suit standing by the auditorium door with his arms crossed, teaching his boss's niece second-grade science because the boss cannot figure it out. And sometimes a hero is a 21-year-old mother who keeps the child she could have let go, leaves school to raise her, works until her body collapses, and never sells the ring, even on nights when that ring is the only thing standing between her daughter and hunger, because the ring is the only proof that her child has a father, and that mother would rather die than erase that proof. Family is who shows up, not when the sun is shining, not when the bills are paid and the refrigerator is full and everything is fine. Family is who shows up when the red notice is taped to the door, when the debt collection calls ring at midnight, when the medicine bottle on the counter is empty, and when a 7-year-old child has to walk alone through a snowstorm because there is no one else to walk in her place. Family is not blood. Family is who chooses to stay, who chooses not to sleep all night sitting on the floor beside their daughter's bed watching her breathe after someone dared to say her name on the phone, who chooses to get up every morning and go back to school at 28 after the world has taken nearly everything away, who chooses to hold the hand of the person beside them under a white tablecloth every winter and say nothing because some things do not need words. If you are listening to this story and you were once Rosie, the child who had to grow up too soon because the adults around you could not protect you enough, this story is yours. If you were once Bryn, the mother, the woman who fought alone for so long that she forgot she was allowed to ask someone for help, this story is yours too. And if you were once the one who stepped in when the whole world stepped out, the one who showed up not because of obligation but because of choice, the one who tore the red notice from the door and slipped it into a suit pocket as if it had never existed, then you know this story is about you. If you are listening from your living room after dinner, from your bed before closing your eyes, from your phone in the dark after a long, exhausting day, I want you to know one thing. There is always someone out there willing to run toward you. You have not seen them yet, but they are closer than you think. They might be sitting beside you right now. They might be one phone call away. They might be driving through a snowstorm without you knowing it. How do you feel after the story of Rosie, Bryn, and Dario tonight? Share it with us in the comments below. Have you ever met someone who showed up right when you thought no one cared anymore? Or were you the one who stepped in for someone when they needed it most? Tell us your story. We want to listen to every experience, every feeling from the deepest part of your heart. If this story touched you, please press like so more people can hear Rosie's story. Share it with someone you think needs to hear it tonight. And if you have not subscribed to our channel yet, Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss new stories every day. Stories told from the heart and meant for the heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days with the people you love. Thank you for staying until the very last moment. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.